It really wasn't about the tools. It was really about decision clarity and kind of moving beyond the tools. The server team's not going to know which one of these services is most important to the business, right? It would be the service owners who would understand, am I willing to accept this risk?
Who owns the fix as well? Like, I mean, it's great for me to find a vulnerability, but who's going to patch the vulnerability was a big question.
The team's really drowning in data. It's not you don't have a telemetry. It's how do you kind of work through that data? I come to you, the remediation owner, and you crack open a spreadsheet and start arguing that your data is different than my data, right? That happens a lot.
There was this obsession with zero tickets or automated remediation. Is that even still possible, or is it too early?
Compliance in many cases just proves activity. And, hey, I closed my critical vulnerability in 21 days, but it's not tied to the actual risk.
If you have worked on vulnerability management, whether in cloud or data center, the same way I have, one thing was always clear. It was always a silo-based approach. We either talk to the cloud team for infrastructure problems, or you talk to the AppSec team for AppSec vulnerabilities. And that used to be okay for a traditional world, but with cloud, containers, and now with AI, that world has gotten a lot more complex. In this particular conversation, I had a chance to speak to Brad from Brinqa, who spoke about how in the past 20 years, vulnerability management has evolved all the way from starting at vulnerability management to risk-based vulnerability management. And these days, a lot more about exposure management, because it's not enough for us to talk about the infrastructure app in its own silo, but also talking about the critical vulnerabilities that are there across the board. Isn't that what security is supposed to be? Keeping the critical assets secure. We spoke about how you can uplift your existing program to exposure management, how AI is impacting this particular field, and why is exposure management a better approach than the traditional risk-based vulnerability management program that we would have been following for years on end. And I know for sure that used to have problems in terms of ownership. Who is the risk owner? Who is the remediation owner? Can I do auto remediation? All those questions were answered in this particular episode. And if you know someone who's working on uplifting in a vulnerability management program or looking at a vulnerability management program from scratch, definitely share this episode with them. And if you have been watching and listening an episode of Cloud Security Podcast and have been finding it valuable, I would really appreciate if you can take a quick second to hit the subscribe or follow, whether it's on Apple, Spotify, or on YouTube or LinkedIn. I really appreciate the support. It's free for you to do. It takes only a second, but it means a lot when you support the work we do and help us reach more people by hitting the subscribe and follow button. Thank you so much for taking that 1 second. And I hope you enjoyed this episode with Brad, and I'll talk to you soon. Peace. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Cloud Security Podcast. I've got Brad with me. Thank you for coming on the show, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited.
I'm excited for this conversation about vulnerability management because maybe before I jump into it, could you share a bit about yourself and where you are and what your journey has been?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Brad Hibbert. So I've been in the security space for 25, 30 years now. Started back in the day more on the development side, did a development in computer science and business in university. Kind of went onto the vendor side about 25 years ago and got into the security space about 20 years ago and wearing different hats. So I've been everywhere as like vulnerability management. I was doing that in 2010 where we had our own vulnerability scanner, our own endpoint protection solution. It was kind of back in the day when vulnerabilities were fresh and new and programs were just kind of getting started. And then, as the market started to mature and things like the cloud started to explode and the perimeter started to dissolve, I got interested in insider risk, and so I went over to privileged access management for a while, building out those solutions, and then went over to third-party risk. So usually in the role of product or corporate strategy, and kind of building these solutions that working with customers. And I think over the course of that period, I kind of realized it really wasn't about the tools, right? It was really about decision clarity and kind of moving beyond the tools, and that led me more towards exposure management as a discipline. And that's kind of what I'm doing here at Brinqa. I'm the COO and Chief Strategy Officer for Brinqa, who we create enterprise-wide or enterprise-grade industrial strength exposure management decision layers and decision platforms for companies.
Awesome. Yeah, because I think as you kind of said that, I was just like, oh, yeah, because I think in a lot of people look at vulnerability management as just patch management. That's kind of where it starts and ends for a lot of people. And I'm sure it is still the case for a lot of companies. You mentioned how it's kind of evolved with cloud coming into the picture and infrastructure, containers, and all of that. It's kind of kept kind of exploding at that point in time. Now we're in this. Now we're in the world of AI as well. So,
yeah.
How have you seen that change? Because I imagine it's not that we don't care about patch management anymore. That's still important, right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it certainly has changed. I mean, the market certainly evolved. As I said, 20 years ago, we were dealing with large customers. As you mentioned, it was all about the servers and patching servers. And They might have done a scan once a quarter to meet their compliance requirement. Then maybe they moved it to monthly, right? But the market certainly evolved quite a bit since then. Still
Yeah.
many of the same challenges, just too much data, too many teams, working in silos and those sorts of things. But I think that, generally speaking, you're right. I think that the market shifted. I think that, the cloud explosion, certainly, today assets are a lot more dynamic and interconnected than they were in the past. It's not just about a server. It's about the business services that server is supporting.
Mm.
And so a server could be supporting multiple services. Those services could be spread across multiple processing units and storage units and those sorts of things. So everything's more interconnected now than it's ever been in the past. And I think that with all of this explosion of assets and different layers of exposures, certainly I think that context matters a lot more than it did in the past. Right? It's not just about getting the raw findings, but it's figuring out kind of with the context of businesses, kind of what to focus your teams on to have the biggest impact on risk reduction. And for that, I would say a lot more of it now is on kind of prioritization versus discovery, which I think it was more in 20 years ago.
Interesting. Because I think you mentioned risk there. Because I was going to say most of the vulnerability management business units that I was managing, or the teams that I was managing, a lot of the conversations always came around. I mean, I guess risk was that, for lack of a better word, a stick that we were using, not the carrot, to go, hey, this is a high risk vulnerability. It needs to be patched within 24 hours, high, low, medium, however you want to take it. So and maybe if you can start, because maybe some people don't know, what is risk-based vulnerability management and how it's different?
Yeah, sort of risk-based vulnerability management and the kind of so in its evolution into exposure management, I guess, is kind of where it's at today. I think as you mentioned, I think vulnerabilities are just weaknesses. So it could be weaknesses in software, it could be configuration weaknesses and those sorts of things. And as you mentioned, I think a lot of people who they start their vulnerability programs would start with something like infrastructure scanning. So they would start with scanning their desktops and their servers and those sorts of things. And then, as you mentioned, sort of the whole cloud came into being, and that brought with it additional types of exposures, right? So now you had cloud management layers, you have containers, you have these environments that are much more software defined and ephemeral, and you're trying to manage all of these things. Can have these vulnerabilities or like exposures, if you will, and many of them are being managed by different tools, right? So different teams have different tools. You have code scanners that finds open source issues or issues within your code, and application scanners. You have API scanners. You have traditional vulnerability scanners and so forth. You have scanners that scan just the cloud environments. All these different tools being used, and they're really kind of siloed, showing you a partial view of risk. And so I think initially when you kind of started looking at these lists of exposures, certainly I think risk-based vulnerability management helped with that. It improved by giving you some level of prioritization on this backlog of increasing exposures, but it was still very narrow. You're still looking at it from that view of that tool, right? And I think that that was the first kind of going from just raw list into kind of risk-based vulnerability management. And then exposure management kind of grew out of that, which is really how do you connect risk across all these different domains and all these different tools and look at it from a more holistic level. Yeah, and not look at it so much as reporting or prioritizing the risks, but really looking at it from what are the outcomes and how do you drive that risk out of the business.
Interesting, because I was going to say, I'm glad you mentioned it's a natural evolution of it as well. Because initially, one of the bigger challenges people had was who owns the fix as well. Like, I mean, it's great for me to find a vulnerability, but who's going to patch the vulnerability was a big question. So does exposure management kind of address that as well in terms of prioritization, or where does that fit into this picture of exposure management and risk-based vulnerability management?
Yeah, I think it's changed. I think from a fixed perspective, teams are going to have to go and ultimately do the work. I like to think of it in terms of who owns the risk, and then who applies it, who fixes it, who's the remediation owner. And I think traditionally in the past, you would do a mapping of, a server to a team mapping. So the risk on this server belongs to the server team, as an example. Right. Yeah. But I really think the way that things have evolved, where it's not just about the server, it's about the services, it's about the value that the services are providing to the business, that you kind of need to map two things. One is the service owner. And so, for example, if a server has multiple applications or is supporting multiple services, right? One might be a service that's providing a service to your internal employees, right? It might also be providing support for a service that's providing a service to your customers, right? the server team's not going to know which one of these services is most important to the business, right? It would be the service owners that understand that, would understand, am I willing to accept this risk, or how do I want to take the next steps of addressing the risk? So there's those that own the risk itself, and then there's those that actually would go and perform the remediation. And so if I take a look at something like a service, that service might be running on servers, might be in cloud containers, running might be custom code within your internal development teams, right? So I own the risk as the service owner, but when exposures happen that could impact my service, I have to mobilize those remediation teams to go fix it. And so those teams could be, if it's in the code, it could be the code team. If it's in the cloud, it could be the cloud team. If it's on the server, it could be a server team to do a patch or make a configuration change. And so I would say that the fixers are still similar to what they've been in the past, but exposure management is just a way to coordinate, better prioritize based on the needs of the business, and to coordinate the fixes across those different teams, right? Across those different stacks.
And I guess you go to your point, what you said earlier as well, because previously when the vulnerability management days were a lot more simpler, I say simple with the asterisks, I'm sure it was complex for a lot of people. It used to be as simple as I have a data center, I have some web servers that are facing the internet, which needs to be patched. The internal ones could be patched, not patched, depending on the risk that there was. But with the new workflow that we have in cloud, where I have internal services that are perhaps used by external people as well, we have APIs, containers, cloud.
Identity.
I mean, now AI as well. Actually, out of curiosity, how is AI impacting vulnerability management? Is there an impact from it onto this particular space?
AI, absolutely. I think, as you think about, again, the telemetry that's coming in, again, you have these more interconnected, more dynamic, more ephemeral, assets that you're trying to protect, right? So not just servers and workstations and so forth, and cloud workloads and APIs and containers and identities and all these sorts of things. You're doing that across teams, and there's plus threat intelligence that you want to start pulling into the environment, and additional telemetry and context coming in for your assets from your asset management solutions and so on. So the teams are really drowning in data, right? And it's not you don't have the telemetry, you have a lot of data. It's how do you kind of work through that data, right, to make sure that you're focusing not just on exposures, but exposures that could impact your business. Are those exposures in your environment, are they reachable? Are they exploitable? If they are exploited, what's the blast radius? So there's a lot of data that you can use to help you kind of refine that prioritization and decisioning that you need to do. And AI is certainly a great way to help you kind of do that. It can help you make the connections that as a human is difficult to make. So if you start to look at attacker behavior, to attack techniques, to the way that these exploits are being leveraged, to what mitigating controls you have in place. And so there's just a number of different data elements that could be tied together. And the use of AI certainly helps you make those connections very quickly, and allows you to, the challenge is that you have to trust the opinions that these AI models are producing, right? And so for me, I always tell people AI is great. Automation is always great. It can speed things up. You want it to speed the right things up. So you want to make sure that your AI is based on a sound data foundation. So you're bringing all this information from all these different systems, right? Because exposure management kind of sits above the tools. So you're bringing all this information in, you're normalizing that. You have a shared understanding of risk and how you're measuring risk and prioritizing risk, across the different teams. But ultimately, when your AI models start to work on that data that you have high confidence in, then you can start to trust the AI models, right? Are making those decisions that you can trust, and that allows people to take action on those opinions or those decisions that the AI models are providing to you much more quickly. If you don't believe in the data, if you're suspect over the opinions coming out of the AI, then you're not going to take action based on those outputs, right? And so I certainly think that it can help you surface what actually matters in the environment, but it has to do that in a way that's explainable and defensible. And if it does, and it can do that across the teams, then it can build trust in that prioritization process much more quickly than you can do without the machinery in place.
I guess it sounds like AI is making a positive impact if you can get it to a point where you can trust it. What was it before? Because obviously we spoke about the vulnerability management as it used to be before, where life was a lot more simpler. Then you moved to the risk-based vulnerability management. Now we are in this world of exposure management with sprinkle of AI, complex workflows, complex environments. how is this all mapping together in how vulnerability management, let's just call it what the vulnerability management flow is like today compared to what it used to? Because you've been in this space for a long time. How do you see it done differently now in the customers you're talking to? Is it like a lot more people using AI, or is it more exposure management is the new way that you guys are seeing it's moving forward with helping prioritize these complex workflows? It's a majority use cases that you come across.
Yeah, I certainly think exposure management is on the rise. I think organizations are taking a step back. Um, they're realizing that they have too many tools, right? They have too many teams working in isolation. Each team has their own understanding of prioritization and how it should work, right? And so it's really not efficient and it's not effective. And so organizations are realizing they have to take a step back and look beyond the tools, right, and implement the program that kind of goes back to the people, processes, and technology, right, and
Yep.
implement a shared understanding of risk across these teams to get alignment to really focus on the outcomes, which is reducing exposures that can impact the business, which is typically tied to the business services. And so we are seeing organizations really kind of lean into this, where they starting with risk-based vulnerability management. And again, so that's just kind of taking your raw lists and you're starting to add some level, I'll say coarse-grained level of context,
Yep.
where you're bringing in some asset context and maybe some threat intelligence to help prioritize the risks. But again, risk-based is a good step, but again, it's very siloed into those individual teams and individual platforms or tools that they're using. And so the next step is a layer above that risk-based vulnerability management. You're kind of get that to that next level of diligence. It's not about how many vulnerabilities or critical vulnerabilities did you close that day. It's about how much risk did you take out of the organization, right? That could impact the business. And again, typically tied back to some sort of business services. And from that perspective, it's really about not just do you have an exposure in your environment, but again, it's getting to the next level. Is it reachable in my environment? Is it exploitable in my environment? Again, it goes back to that blast radius. So that context to the next level and getting more laser focused and fine grained on focusing on really what could impact the business, right? And it's shifting the conversation from a risk-based vulnerability management, which is typically here's a prioritized report of exposures, to now I got to go do something about it. So it's a shift from reporting to remediation, because exposure management is all about getting that prioritization done at a finer level, but
Yep.
then mobilizing the orchestrating the remediation that needs to happen to remove that risk from the environment across the different teams, right? Does that
Do you
make
find
sense?
that? Oh, sorry, I'll let you finish your thought.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that makes sense, and any follow-up questions there.
Yeah. It does. I was also going to say a lot of organizations also have multiple CMDBs, asset inventories, and sometimes unknown users as well. There's no asset owner sometimes because the person moved on and there was no replacement or the team name changed. I've been in organizations where I was part of, I don't know, some team name, which is everyone has an interesting team name for the development teams and everyone else. But suddenly people decide that, hey, is that no longer the team name? It's going to be another team name. But then what happens to the assets that are assigned to it? A lot of people may already have, I don't want to use the word spaghetti, but there's definitely a lot of processes are already implemented and they've been doing this for a long time. And risk-based vulnerability management was that thing that they decided on, because to what you said, it gives you a clear picture for, hey, what's my exposure to high risk vulnerabilities today and how many of them are actually exposed. Moving from that kind of approach to exposure management, I'm curious, what do you see as some of the challenges that people come across?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mind shake. And you think about exposure management, it's sitting above the tools, right? So the tools can change over time. You might get different scanners and different application scanners, and as you mentioned, your CMDBs may change. You may have multiple CMDBs. So exposure management sits on top of that, and it curates and normalizes all of that telemetry, if you will, to give you really a program that has longevity in it, right? So all these things are changing, but your program continues to operate effectively and efficiently. But to your point, I mean, the challenge is it's a mindset. It's really a mind shift change, right? People are moving from tools and above the tools to think about exposures more broadly, across the business services. And one of the biggest challenges that we have are, as you mentioned, it's the data inconsistencies. This is what my tool says. Your tool says something different.
Yeah.
So when you're making a risk-based decision, which tool do we believe in? And
Yeah.
so that certainly comes up, and that's kind of one of the things that we need to do when we work with companies looking to evolve their programs. into more exposure management is like, how do you define risk? Let's have one prioritization strategy across the program, and get the teams to agree to that ahead of time. And so I think that's one is just what you don't want to do in an exposure management program is I come up with this great list of things I need to get done, but then I come to you as the remediation owner, and I say, hey, can you go fix this? And you crack open a spreadsheet and start arguing that your data is different than my data, right? I mean, that happens a lot. And so I think having that shared, understanding of risk and how you're going to calculate risk is critical. And then having explainability on why you feel that your data is giving you the best decisioning capability that you can is pretty important. And then having that shared ownership of risk is also critical. I mean, if you're a server guy looking at the server vulnerabilities, you're gonna look at them one way. But if your server is running multiple services and I'm the service owner, I might be telling you to do things a little bit differently, right? And so there's a shared ownership kind of over that model. But clearly, I own the risk. I'm the risk owner. You're the remediation owner in that particular case. So I think that's an issue. I think the other issue that comes up, you mentioned it earlier, is trust. As you're collecting all this telemetry, even when you have a shared understanding of the data model and how you're going to prioritize the risks in your environment, or what algorithms you're going to apply, and so forth, or what AI you're going to apply, it's when you start coming out with the outputs of those decisions, right? Like you having opinions coming out of your risk models or coming out of your AI models. Like, how do you trust that? And how do you, as a server team, trust that what I'm telling you and how you want to mobilize your teams is the right thing to do and is the most optimal thing to do to reduce risk, across the business? And so, I would say that the lack of trust in how you're doing the scoring, the lack of trust in the AI. Again, the more transparent you can be, the stronger, the more trustworthy, or the higher level of confidence you have in that data layer. These are all things that go towards establishing a good foundation of trust, right? I think that certainly helps out quite a bit. And I think the other one is organizations try to do too much. I think don't try to start your exposure management program going after all your infrastructure, all your applications, all your code repositories. Just start small and kind of show success and kind of grow from there. So,
is there like a readiness check that people should have before they start the exposure management journey? Sounds like, obviously, clearly you've seen this quite often based on what you're sharing. I'm curious, is there like obviously each one of us would like to believe that we have the best program, but we all know all the bandages that we have put in across over the years as well. Is there, and in my mind, is there a minimum standard or a readiness criteria that you think people should consider before they go down the path of moving from, say, a risk-based approach to an exposure management approach?
We certainly have a methodology that we've been implementing successfully for a number of years. And again, I think a lot of it is beyond just the technology. It's not about the telemetry. It's not about finding the exposures. It's about, what do you do with these exposures? How do you prioritize, right? How do you, mobilize the troops, if you will, to take the most, I think, impactful action? I think a lot of that just comes down to there has to be executive commitments at the top layer that exposure management is a discipline that an organization wants to embrace. And I think from that perspective, there has to be a shared responsibility across the different teams. They have to have a shared understanding of risk across the different teams. In many cases, I would say there needs to be a shared incentive program, so they're all working towards the same goal across the different teams. If different teams are incented different ways, hey, I got to close vulnerabilities faster, and based on CVSS, if different teams are being mobilized in different ways today, that could create friction and conflict, right? So I think it's got to start at that higher level. And then, you have to have that shared understanding of risk. You have to have a shared and agreed escalation paths of risk. You have to have clear decision authority for who owns the risk and versus who's going to remediate the risks. And then I think you also have to have dedicated resources. Most of the programs that we've seen, just to drive the accountability and the movement across the different teams and coordinate the activities across the teams, it does require some resourcing and some investment. And so I think exposure management itself can't be looked at as sort of a side project. People have to be serious. It's a different discipline around security to help drive more and derive more value out of the investments you've made in those existing tools. But we have a more technical and tactical methodology that we follow as well, with respect to connectors and normalization of data. But at a high level, those are some of, I think, the more important things.
And Because I think as you were saying this, the first thing that came to mind was I remember the first vulnerability management team that I was working with. There was this obsession with zero tickets or automated remediation, especially when we started in cloud, because at that point in time, a lot of CNAP providers or CSPM providers back then were talking about automated remediation as the answer to vulnerability management, especially in the cloud context.
Yeah.
How does this work in the, and maybe how much truth is there in doing that with exposure management, or is that like a parallel path that people should follow, or does that come under exposure management? Where do you see the automated remediation, and is that still possible, or are we too early?
Yeah, I think it's still possible. I think when I take a look at the market, from an exposure management evolution perspective, I think the first sort of wave of exposure management was really about data orchestration. It was really about taking all of those feeds, and as you mentioned, you could have multiple CMDBs and multiple scanners and multiple threat intelligence feeds and so forth. So it's taking that information and normalizing that in a
Yeah.
way that people could do something with it. And I would say that was more data orchestration. I think where we're at today is really more decision orchestration, where people want the exposure management solutions to have opinionated interfaces, right? To tell you, we used to think, based on our modeling and based on the AI models, this is what you should do, and here's why you should do it across the different teams that would have the biggest impact on risk reduction. So it went from data orchestration to decision orchestration. And to your point, I think the next point would really be around, action orchestration or mediation orchestration, right? And I still think that some of that can be done today, right? There's a lot of automated remediation companies that will do that. We'll take some telemetry, and based on some modeling, we'll go out and do some fixes. I think really what it comes down to is how much do you want to trust the models that are telling you to do the fixes. If you don't trust the model to have your teams go do things and configuration and patches and so on, you certainly don't want to have that automatically happening without your team's involvement. So I think it will evolve. I think that automation works well for known patterns, like if it's a simple fix or configuration change or something you've done in the past, where the AI can look back and see previous behavior and say, hey, I have a 90% confidence that this is the right thing to do. And so I think if you put some golden rules or golden images or guardrails in place, you can start to automate some of those kind of known patterns. But if it's risky change, if it's something where it could have an impact on a critical service, we were talking about those services earlier, like if it's a customer facing service or something like that, or it can have significant damage in some way, then you may not automate it 100%. You still might want a human in the loop, where you can automate everything, but a human has to click the button. But I do think that that's where the market's kind of moving towards, kind of autonomous remediation. And I think, I think that exposure management really kind of balances that speed and control, right? Where you want to be very prescriptive on what you're fixing.
Mm-hmm.
You want to get to that next level of prescription over what you've done with risk-based vulnerability management, right? So again, is it exploitable? Is it reachable? What's the blast radius, right? You want your remediations to be more prescriptive as well. So what is the minimum amount of effort that you can do, or the least impactful remediation for this particular exposure that I have? And as long as you're getting that level of prescription, where you're removing the risk of or minimizing the risk of impact, then you can start to automate those things more and more over time. And I do think that's kind of where the market's going to continue to move towards.
Interesting, because I was going to also say a lot of the organizations are compliance driven. You mentioned the organizations are evolving as well as they approach this from moving from data to decision. Now we've collected data for a long time. Now we are automating decisions, hopefully then dealing on to auto remediation. In terms of companies that are driven or driving vulnerability management through the stick of compliance, especially in the regulated bodies, which a lot of enterprises are.
Yeah.
If they see I have a PCI critical in 30 days,
Yeah.
and how does exposure management work in this particular case, where you're still able to show demonstrably that you are reducing risk quarter by quarter? Because as a CISO, that's what I care about. I mean, I want my team to be able to report back, so I can report to the board that, hey, yep, it's all under control. But I still need some budget. That's a different story. But
Yeah.
how does exposure management work in that kind of environment where it's more compliance led?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it goes back to what I mentioned like 20 years ago, when people would they'd scan on a quarterly basis. As you mentioned, for PCI, I have to close my critical vulnerabilities in 30 days, right? And so again, things have evolved past then, and compliance tends to drag behind kind of the realities of what CISOs are facing today. But I would say that the compliance in many cases just proves activity. So as you mentioned, hey, I closed my critical vulnerability in 21 days or 18 days, right? So you're proving that there's activity, but it's not tied to the actual risk, right, that you're taking out of the environment. And so I think that when you think about compliance proves activity, exposure management, I think proves impact or risk reduction in the environment. So you tie it back to, again, I removed this much risk from this particular business service as opposed to I cleared off my critical vulnerabilities off my servers, right? So it's a different way to look at risk. And I would say, you're kind of moving from sort of SLA adherence to your PCI example, more towards, exposure reduction and exposures that will and can have a significant impact on the business. So they're exploitable, they're reachable, all those sorts of things. And to your point, though, I think it's not just looking at a number; it's showing that quarter over quarter improvement as well. Like here's my critical business services, and I've reduced my risk or my exposures to these services month over month in a very methodical way. So I think that's the difference. One's kind of focused on outcomes and impact, where one's kind of more focused on kind of checking. I don't want to say checking the box, but demonstrating that activity has been prescribed. Activity has been performed.
So someone who's, I imagine most enterprise already have a vulnerability management program. They either have the risk-based vulnerability management program, or they have some kind of a tooling like a CMDB, which is just some kind of tag to say if it's vulnerable or not. For people who are already running a program for vulnerability management in their organization and looking to transition over to uplifting it in the new year with exposure management, what are some of the maturity milestones that you can throw as examples for, hey, this is level 1, this is level 2? Are there any examples that you can share that people can use as a metrics for this is how, or maybe they're even collecting data today, they just don't know that they were so close to exposure management. So are there any maturity levels that come to mind that people can look at themselves for? Are they ready for exposure management? And if they are, these are the steps you can probably look as milestones.
Yeah, I think that I think there's 2 points to that. As you mentioned, I think the risk-based vulnerability management is a great foundation to kind of build exposure management on top of, kind of to move beyond the tooling.
Yeah.
And I think that as people, I think the one thing people get worried about is that as they move to exposure management is that are they going to have to give up all that domain knowledge they built into all those tools?
Yeah.
Because again, a lot of these teams have been doing this for a long time, and they're rather good at kind of prioritizing things within their
process is already defined as well. Everyone's using it.
Exactly. So they're already doing things their way. And so I think, as you look to embrace something like exposure management, you don't want to lose that domain knowledge, right? So if there's domain knowledge, you want to make sure that you can retain as much as you can. So again, exposure management kind of sits above the tools and helps kind of work across and normalize and curate that those insights from across those different teams. And so if there's knowledge that those different teams have that's important to the business, you want to make sure that you keep that. And so again, you want to make sure that you can hold that in. If there's processes that are static and not really viable in today's kind of dynamic world, then you might want to retire some of those decision making workflows and kind of just making sure that they're robust enough and sustainable enough from a more modern decisioning process. Milestones is difficult. I would say that if organizations are going to start with exposure management, I guess the one thing would be, don't try to boil the ocean would be my, understand and get that shared understanding of risk across the different teams, like what's important to the business.
Yep.
And you're never going to start with perfect data, but perfect systems. But pick an area of the business that you want to evolve beyond risk-based vulnerability management to an area where, risks are visible, where they're painful in the organization today. So that could be on a set of services. Maybe it's one service or 2 services that you want to focus on, getting that next level of prescription. Maybe it's your external attack surface. Whatever the area is within your organization, focus on that first. And anything that has like exposure, external exposure, critical applications, the crown jewels. So focus on a couple of those things, and then focus on the decisions. Don't focus on the scope of the program. So just kind of make sure you kind of dig in, get to that next level of prioritization that takes in consideration, the different constituents in the program, and then show that you have success. We have many customers of ours have dozens of different applications that they've kind of brought into the program, but they started with one, and then kind of once they showed some value and showed how they're making better decisions that better align to the business itself, then they expanded. Kind of once they've proven that the model was working.
Also go for the friendlies because, to your point, it's not just a change in the tooling or you're introducing a new tool, but you're also changing the way ownership is done, the responsibility. You're what you mentioned, the remediation owner versus the risk owner. This is an organization change as well in a way. So you probably want some friendlies in the beginning to start the program going, so you can show some points on the screen to go, oh yeah, this actually works. Now we can start scaling it out across the entire organization.
That's right, and demonstrate that you've actually reduced impactful risk to the business, right,
Yeah.
in a meaningful way. And again, that I go back to making sure that if you're going to be doing it, some milestones would be making sure you do your preparatory work. So as I mentioned, we bring on a number of organizations that start with more of the infrastructure, maybe their external attack surface, and then very quickly want to start pivoting more to more critical services like business services or applications where they're cranking out code every day to support these different applications that their businesses rely on.
Yeah.
But every one of those teams, every one of those development teams does things differently. They use Jira differently. They manage tickets differently. And so, I would say one of the things you want to make sure is that you can accommodate that as you onboard those teams. You want to force them to some sort of corporate, kind of way of doing things, and everyone has to use the standard workflow.
Yeah.
Certainly that helps, but you want to make sure that you can accommodate those teams. If they want to see tickets by technology, that's fine. If they want to see tickets bundled by sprint, because that aligns to how they do their coding, you want to make sure you can accommodate those teams to reduce the friction where possible, and kind of make sure that they don't see or you remove the friction point of them embracing the program, I guess, as much as you can, right? We're not changing all of their day-to-day workflows and tasks. So we've got customers who use 20 different flavors of Jira, and we can accommodate that with our products. So we're not asking them all to change the way they develop code, but we're showing them where in their code that they should fix exposures by using a broader, more business-aligned prioritization and model that's explainable and defendable. So
awesome. No, thank you so much for that. Those are all the technical questions I had. I've got 3 fun questions for you as well. Shouldn't take that long. But for the first one is, what do you spend most time on when you're not trying to solve exposure management problems of the world?
Oh, well, yeah, that's I take on another challenge I've had for the last 30 years of just trying to learn how to golf. So that's I'm getting a little older now. That's the yeah. Yeah, I have a handicap, but it's not something I'm going to share on online today.
Oh, yeah. Fair. Second question: what is something that you're proud of that is not on your social media?
Something I'm proud. Like I think over the last number of years, I've really got to work with some great people. I think, and I think that we've really established, I think, some good programs and some good defenses in a lot of the big companies kind of around the world that are still being used today. So I'm pretty proud of that, and I'm pretty proud of the fact that the people I've worked with, I continue to work with over the last 20 years. So it's been, I think the security industry is very tight. A lot of great people in the industry, and I think I've built up a lot of friendships, and both personal and professional friendships that have lasted a couple of decades. So I'm pretty happy about that.
That's awesome, man. And final question: what's your favorite cuisine or restaurant that you can share with us?
I know the new one here is called the Turkish Kebab House. I'm up in Ottawa, Canada, so it's been my go-to place now for the last few months. Yeah,
I mean, kebabs you can never go wrong with kebabs. So I'll definitely agree with that as well.
Yeah.
I mean, those are all the questions I had. Where can people connect with you to know more about Brinqa, the work you guys do, and maybe connect with you as well on talking further about what we spoke about?
Yeah, so again, I know we didn't talk too much about the background of exposure management in general, what we do as a company. If you're interested in exposure management, or you want to evolve your program to that next level where you're looking kind of beyond the tools and trying to get more focused on outcomes versus prioritize lists of things to fix, you can get more information from www.brinqa.com, or you can fire me an email at Brad Hibbert, brad.hibbert@brinqa.com as well.
I'll put your information and your LinkedIn link as well as the Brinqa website on the show notes as well for people to follow up. But thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you everyone for tuning into the episode as well. Thanks, Brad. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for listening or watching this episode of Cloud Security Podcast. This was brought to you by TechRiot.io. If you are enjoying episodes on cloud security, you can find more episodes like these on cloudsecuritypodcast.tv, our website, or on social media platforms like YouTube, LinkedIn, and Apple Spotify. In case you are interested in learning about AI security as well, do check out our sister podcast called AI Security Podcast, which is available on YouTube, LinkedIn, Spotify, Apple as well, where we talk to other CISOs and practitioners about what's the latest in the world of AI security. finally, if you're after a newsletter, it just gives you top news and insight from all the experts we talk to at Cloud Security Podcast. You can check that out on cloudsecurity.newsletter.com. I'll see you in the next episode. Peace.